Today we're going to go over the absolute basics of watercolor, the three main things: the paper, the paint, and the brushes. And this video is going to be for someone who is completely new to watercolor, has never done it, and is just looking for a starting point. You know, it doesn't even know some of the right questions to ask. So these will be a lot of the things that I first learned when I was getting into watercolor. I'm still pretty new to watercolor, but I've at least learned enough that I can pass some of the information on. So this is obviously watercolor paper. You'll notice down here it says 140 pounds. So this is basically the thickness or the weight of the paper. So you'll notice that watercolor paper is thicker. This is obviously so that it can actually absorb the water, which is the medium that you're using clearly. So you cannot use just normal drawing paper, really. It just can't handle the weight of the water that's going into the paper. And even with actual watercolor paper, one of the things that you'll notice is how it's buckling. The paper will buckle once it gets wet. Now there's ways to kind of avoid that, which is through pre-soaking your paper. You're gonna tape your paper. I'm gonna go into all that in a separate video, but for now, just know that if you're getting into watercolor and you wanna practice, you're gonna need actual watercolor paper. This pad, I bought, I wanna say for around like $3 to $5. And it's got 30 sheets, so it's not terribly expensive. Now, this is probably the least expensive watercolor paper that you can get, which also means that the quality is good for watercolor paper, but it's not great. I'll kind of get into that in a future video in terms of how the pigment on the paint will flow depending on the quality of paper that you have. But if you're just getting started in watercolor, and you're gonna practice your washes and just practice whatever other new beginner stuff you wanna do with watercolor, this is great paper to get started with, 140 pound. This is called a watercolor block. And as you can see, 140 pounds. Here's why watercolor blocks are nice, is this paper is actually sealed along the four edges. So it's as if the paper is taped to your desk or taped to a board. The purpose for this is you don't have to pre-soak your water. You can put your watercolor down and the edges will hold, which will keep it from buckling. It's basically just avoids you having to go through the process of pre-soaking and taping onto a board, waiting for it to dry, and then being able to go and do it. So watercolor blocks are really nice. The only downside is they are more expensive. So depending on, it probably isn't something that you're gonna wanna purchase just starting out. It's more for if you've kind of gotten the hang of watercolor and you know what you wanna do and you just want a higher quality paper, then this is a good place to go. But if you see watercolor blocks in the store, that's what this is. Another paper that you can use, so this is actually mixed media. It's also 140 pounds, and it's actually very smooth. It's quite smooth. It's even smoother than normal watercolor paper, even cold press. So you can use this for watercolor. Just know that you might have to be somewhat selective in what you're doing with it. You probably aren't going to want to be doing really heavy washes with it because the paper will still buckle. The paper's not going to hold up as well as actual watercolor paper, but if you've got some cheap mixed media paper and you're just getting into watercolor and you want to start practicing, you can use this. On to the brushes. This is a Winsor & Newton watercolor brush. It's Cotman brand. With watercolor, you have three different qualities or stages. You've got the really cheap grade, then you've got the student grade, which is what this is, Cotman, and then you've got artist grade. And that's the same for the brushes and the paints, which I'll be getting into the paints next. But if you're doing watercolor, you need actual watercolor brushes. This brush was probably around $8. This brush was probably in that range, $6 to $8. And if you're just getting into watercolor, you only really need 2 to 3 brushes. This is a size 12 round watercolor brush. This is going to be your go-to brush for almost everything. This might look kind of big, but you know, once you get it wet with paint and water, the tip will actually get surprisingly small, and you can get into some small areas, smaller than you would think. This is a flat wash brush, and this is obviously for covering larger areas. If you want to create a background that's really smooth with a wash, this is the type of brush that you're going to use. The reason that watercolor brushes are so important to use is because they are made to hold the water. I know that seems obvious, but this, you'll go into different art stores and you'll see packs of these that'll come in, you know, 8 to 10. I can pretty much guarantee you that you should never buy a pack of brushes together. They're not quality, and they will not hold water like an actual watercolor brush. So what's going to happen is when you start practicing your washes, you're not going to know whether you're doing it correctly or not, whether you're using the right technique, or whether the brush just isn't holding the water like it should. So you have to use an actual watercolor brush. Like I said, this is probably $5 to $8 for one brush. It can seem kind of expensive, but it's a one-time purchase. If you treat it right, it'll last for a really long time. If you get into watercolor, then you can step it up and get an even more expensive watercolor brush. Alright, so getting into the paints, I almost want to say that the paints are the most important part, but the reality is I would call the 3 things I'm covering today like the trinity of watercolor. They're all equally separate but equally important. Your paper, your paint, and your brushes. If you have one that isn't up to par, the whole thing is kind of not going to work out very well for you. I've got a range of paints here that I've gathered over time. When I first started teaching myself watercolor through YouTube videos, this was the paint that I was using. This I actually bought while in Malaysia, and this is about as cheap a watercolor as you can get. That is going to be terrible. You're not going to be able to get any sort of flat wash or anything in that. You can't practice with that type of paint because there isn't pigment in this. So there's actual pigment in these higher quality paints, which means when you mix the water with it and then you spread it on the paper, that pigment is going to spread evenly. I'm going to show that in a different video. Right now I'm just kind of explaining it and why the different paints are important. So this is the cheapest possible paint. This was about $1 US for this tube. And I started practicing my washes and different other techniques through watching YouTube videos, and I couldn't get it right, and it wasn't looking right, and the washes were splotchy. And I came across another YouTube video that was basically telling you the same thing I'm telling you, which is if your paint and your paper and your brushes aren't quality, you're not going to be able to get a smooth wash. So you at least need to get the student grade of those 3 things so you can at least practice your technique and know whether you're doing it correctly. So I ended up going, still in Malaysia, and I got this brand, which is actually a Korean brand called Alpha Watercolors. And the cost of this, I think, was about $35 US. Once I started practicing my washes with these paints, instantly I was getting smooth washes. So it shows you do actually need to have quality materials in order to see in watercolor whether you're doing it correctly or not, and that it's not just a lack of pigments and poor quality paper and poor quality brushes. So that's something to be careful about when you're getting into watercolor. This is Winsor & Newton Cotman brand. So this is the student grade. So this rather big tube, this is 21 milliliters. Generally, watercolor paint will come in 2 different sizes. This is 7.5 milliliters. This is 21 milliliters. This was probably $5 US. This is also probably about $5 to $6 US, but this is called Grumbacher brand. It's a higher quality than Cotman student grade. But if you're just getting into watercolor, Cotman student grade, Winsor & Newton, Cotman student grade watercolor is all you need to get started. Once I practiced enough in watercolor and I felt confident that it was something I was gonna want to continue to pursue, I kind of splurged and bought this artist grade set of watercolors called Mission watercolors. So this Mission watercolor is a step up from this Winsor & Newton Cotman student grade. So this is kind of like the top tier. There's other top tier watercolors as well. This is just one of them. So you can see here, these are tubes, and in a future video I'm going to show you these compared with these, and you will instantly see a difference in vibrancy. You will just see how the paint will spread through the water. It's cheaper as far as the artist grade watercolors go. This was $100 for this whole pack. So if you're just getting started in watercolor, you just want to dip your feet into it, you don't want to spend a whole lot, all you need are three things. You need one good watercolor brush, $5 to $8, size 12 round. One good student grade, not artist grade, but student grade tube of paint, and you only need one color. This was about $5. And one very basic pad of actual watercolor paper. That's it. You just need these three things. So this is about a total investment of $15. You can then take this one paint and you can start to practice your washes and practice the different techniques that you'll come across on different YouTube videos or future videos that I'm gonna make. If you then want to step your game up again, but still not put a whole lot of money into it, you can purchase 2 more tubes. So you can just get the 3 primary colors of paint, and then you can just continue to make all these other different colors using those 3 primary different colors. So that's all you need to get started. So there you have it. Those are the 3 things that you need to get started. It's not a huge monetary investment to try it out, see if you like it. If it turns out you really do like watercolor and you want to dive more in, then you can spend a little extra money and get some of the other things. So in a future video, I'm going to talk about the differences between trays and tubes. As you noticed, I had a lot of tubes. You may not even know what the difference is between trays and tubes, and that's fine. That's what the future video is going to be for. So clearly this video was just meant for someone who is completely new to watercolor. I'm going to be doing some future watercolor tutorials, and I'm going to be doing some easy watercolor things you can kind of follow along with. I just wanted to explain the absolute basics of watercolor before you start to dive into it. A lot of these things were things that I didn't know and I just learned along the way, so hopefully you can kind of jump straight to the end of where I started to learn all of these things about the paper, the paint, and the brushes. So that's it for today. I hope that you learned something from this video and continue to look out for my future videos. Thanks.